Did Harvard teach housekeepers accounting too? Edward Calloway's voice cracked across the dining hall like a glass shattering against marble. Laughter followed instantly, sharp and polished, bouncing beneath the crystal chandeliers of his Aspen estate. Naomi Carter stood frozen beside the long oak table, one hand wrapped around a silver tray, the other still hovering over the contract she had not meant to touch. Outside, snow drifted against floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the room felt too warm, too tight, heavy with expensive perfume and quiet cruelty. Naomi lowered her eyes for half a second. Just enough to swallow the heat climbing into her throat. "I was only trying to help, sir," she said softly. Edward leaned back in his chair, expensive watch catching the amber glow of candlelight. 58. White hair brushed neatly back. The kind of billionaire who carried power like oxygen. Natural. Unquestioned. Around him sat investors in tailored suits, old money faces glowing with amusement over bourbon glasses worth more than Naomi's weekly paycheck. "Help?" Edward scoffed. "You refill water glasses." A few people chuckled harder. One woman smirked into her wine. "Next she will be explaining hedge funds," somebody muttered. Naomi's grip tightened around the tray. Her knuckles ached. She should have stayed quiet. That was the rule. Keep your head down. Smile. Leave unnoticed. But she had heard enough of the conversation while clearing plates to know something felt wrong. Very wrong. The acquisition documents had been sitting open beside Edward's untouched stake. Columns of numbers. Debt ratios. Revenue projections. Familiar patterns she had spent years learning to spot, even if nobody in this house would ever imagine why. "Sir," Naomi said carefully, voice barely above the crackling fireplace, "if you sign that deal tomorrow, I think the company is hiding liabilities." Silence. Small at first. Then absolute. Even the piano player near the staircase missed a note. Edward blinked slowly. "Excuse me?" Naomi swallowed. The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter. "The projections," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "They do not add up." One investor laughed outright. "This is unbelievable." Edward stood. Slowly. Calmly. Somehow that felt worse. His chair scraped against hardwood like a warning. "You are a maid," he said, stepping closer. "Not an analyst." Naomi could smell cedar cologne and aged whiskey as he stopped in front of her. "Do you know what happens when people forget their place?" Her heartbeat stumbled. Around the table, eyes stayed locked on her. Curious. Entertained. Waiting. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "but I think somebody is lying to you." The room shifted. Tiny glances. Nervous hands around glasses. One investor stopped smiling. Edward let out a cold laugh. "Security." Naomi's stomach dropped. At the edge of the room, a guard straightened. "You really think," Edward continued, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "that someone like you understands billion-dollar acquisitions?" Heat crawled up Naomi's neck. Humiliation settled heavy in her chest, familiar and sharp. But still, she could not unsee the numbers. She glanced once toward the open contract on the table. Page 17. The debt transfer clause hidden beneath legal language. Buried deep enough that most people would miss it. Most people. Edward shook his head, almost amused now. "Let me guess," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Harvard taught you mergers too?" More laughter. Louder this time. Cruel. Naomi lowered her gaze again. But something flickered across her face. Small. Gone almost instantly. Not embarrassment. Memory. At the far end of the table, Edward's chief financial officer suddenly leaned forward, squinting hard at the document Naomi had pointed to. His smile disappeared. Color drained from his face. Then, very quietly, he whispered, "Sir, before security takes her out, you need to see this." The room stopped breathing. Edward Calloway turned slowly toward his chief financial officer, irritation still hard in his jaw. "What exactly am I looking at?" he asked, voice flat. The man did not answer right away. He swallowed once, fingers trembling over the open contract as crystal glasses reflected against the polished oak table. Outside, snow pressed harder against the towering windows. Inside, the fire crackled too loud in the silence. "Sir," the CFO said carefully. "Page 17. Edward snatched the document from the table. Around him, investors leaned forward, leather chairs creaking softly. Naomi stayed still near the doorway, tray pressed against her ribs, already halfway dismissed in everyone's mind. Edward flipped the pages fast. His eyes narrowed, then stopped. A quiet shift passed across his face. Small. Dangerous. That clause transfers the debt exposure. The CFO continued, voice low. If tomorrow goes through, you absorb everything. Someone near the end of the table cursed under their breath. Another investor reached for the papers. No, Edward said sharply. That cannot be right. Naomi looked down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The humiliation still burned beneath her skin. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, the weight of every stare in the room. 1 minute ago they were laughing at her. Now nobody seemed comfortable enough to breathe. Edward's hand tightened around the contract. Who caught this? He asked. Silence. Thick. Embarrassed. The CFO hesitated, then glanced toward Naomi. She did. The words landed heavy. A woman in pearls blinked hard. The maid? Somebody whispered. Edward looked back at Naomi for the first time without mockery. Without certainty. She hated that look even more. Surprise. Like he was seeing something he had not expected to exist. Come here, he said. Naomi did not move. Sir? Security muttered awkwardly, suddenly unsure whether to escort her out or step aside. Edward's tone sharpened. I said come here. Her shoes clicked softly against hardwood as she walked back toward the table. Every eye followed her. Judgment had shifted into something stranger now. Curiosity. Suspicion. Naomi stopped beside the chair Edward had been sitting in moments earlier. Explain it, he said. Short. Cold. Testing her. Naomi inhaled slowly. Her palms felt damp. The liability structure changes after acquisition, she said quietly, pointing toward a buried paragraph. Here. Her finger hovered over tiny legal wording. The debt looks hidden because they moved it through shell subsidiaries. But once you sign, it becomes your responsibility. Nobody laughed this time. One investor leaned closer. Another started typing furiously into his phone. Edward stared at the page, jaw tightening harder with every passing second. How? He asked slowly. Does someone cleaning my house know this? Naomi hesitated. Too long. The air changed again. Pressure. She looked toward the giant windows instead of his face. Snow drifted past in silver streaks. I read, she said quietly. Edward gave a humorless laugh. You read? His voice dropped lower. Sharper. You expect me to believe a housekeeper spotted something my legal team missed? Naomi's throat tightened. You do not have to believe me, she said softly. Just verify it. The confidence in her voice unsettled him more than anger would have. Edward turned to his attorney. Check it. The man nodded quickly, already pale. Phones buzzed. Quiet whispers spread around the table. Somebody poured another drink with shaking hands. Naomi stepped back again, ready to disappear before the humiliation returned. But then Edward's executive assistant suddenly froze beside the fireplace, eyes locked on a tablet screen. Sir? She whispered. Nobody answered. She looked up slowly. I think you should see this. Edward frowned. See what? Her expression changed. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Her name, she said quietly, glancing toward Naomi. Naomi Carter. She turned the screen around, voice barely above a whisper. Why is your maid in Harvard Business School alumni records? The room went so quiet the fire suddenly sounded violent. Naomi did not move. She stood beside the polished table, hands folded loosely in front of her apron, while every face in the room turned toward the glowing tablet like something impossible had just crawled out of the dark. Edward Calloway's jaw tightened. "What did you just say?" he asked. His assistant swallowed hard. "Harvard Business School," she repeated quietly. "Naomi Carter. Finance concentration." A nervous laugh escaped from one investor. "Forced. Uncomfortable. There are probably thousands of Naomi Carters," he said quickly. Nobody laughed with him. Edward stepped closer and took the tablet himself. The cold blue light reflected sharply against his watch and silver cufflinks. His eyes scanned the screen once. Then again. A graduation photo stared back at him. Younger. Smiling. Crimson robes. The same woman standing 10 feet away holding a serving tray. Naomi lowered her eyes. Heat crept up her neck again, but this time humiliation mixed with something heavier. Exhaustion. She had spent years learning how invisible people preferred her to be. Edward looked up slowly. "This is a joke." His voice sounded thinner now. Less certain. "You expect me to believe my maid went to Harvard?" Naomi inhaled quietly. "I graduated 8 years ago." A sharp silence followed. One of the investors actually put his drink down. Another unlocked his phone under the table and started searching her name. "No," Edward said immediately, almost cutting the air in half. "No, people with Harvard degrees do not clean houses." Naomi's fingers tightened against the edge of the tray. There it was again. The same look she had seen 100 times before. Not curiosity. Judgment. The belief that intelligence had an acceptable uniform. "Life changes," she said softly. Edward stared at her harder now, like he could force the answer into something he understood. "Then why are you here?" The question landed heavier than he meant it to. Too personal. Too sharp. Naomi hesitated. Just long enough for the room to lean in. Snow tapped softly against the glass windows. Somewhere near the kitchen, a coffee machine hissed alive and then went silent again. "My father got sick," she said finally. "Alzheimer's." Nobody moved. "I left my job to take care of him." Her voice stayed calm, but her thumb pressed hard against the tray until the metal trembled slightly. "Savings disappear faster than people think." One investor looked away. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Edward said nothing. For the first time all night, he seemed unsure what expression belonged on his face. Then his attorney suddenly cleared his throat. Nervous. Sweating now. "Sir," he said carefully, eyes fixed on his laptop. "The liability transfer is real." Edward turned sharply. "What?" "If tomorrow moves forward," the attorney paused, choosing words carefully, "you lose roughly $200 million. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Somebody whispered, "Jesus." Another investor stood up completely. "You mean she just saved us?" Edward looked back at Naomi so fast the movement almost felt angry. But anger was losing ground now to something worse. Shame. Confusion. The kind powerful people hated because they could not control it. "Why did you say anything?" he asked quietly. Naomi blinked once. "Because you were about to sign it." Edward frowned harder. "After the way I spoke to you?" She met his eyes for the first time all evening. Calm. Steady. "Bad people let others fall," she said softly. "Tired people still try to stop it." Nobody in the room knew what to do with that answer. Then suddenly, one investor near the fireplace looked down at his phone and froze. "Wait," he said quietly. His expression changed. Shock first. Then disbelief. "Edward." He turned the screen around slowly. "You might want to see where Naomi worked before she started cleaning houses." Edward took the phone. His face shifted instantly. Because staring back at him was a company profile from one of the biggest investment firms in New York, and Naomi Carter's name was listed beside a headline he knew all too well: "The analyst who predicted the crash no one saw coming." "I do not think you understand what that means." Edward's voice came out lower this time, rough around the edges, like he was trying to hold control with both hands and watching it slip anyway. He stared at the phone screen so hard his reflection blurred against the glass. Around him, the room had shifted. The laughter was gone. Crystal glasses sat untouched now. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak. Naomi stood near the edge of the table, shoulders still, expression unreadable, but inside her chest her heartbeat pressed harder with every passing second. She knew that headline. She wished they had never found it. The analyst who predicted the crash no one saw coming. The investor read aloud quietly, almost afraid of the words. That was you? Naomi said nothing at first. Snow tapped softly against the giant windows behind her, while heat rolled from the stone fireplace in uneven waves. Somebody near the back discreetly raised the phone, camera turning on with a tiny click. The billionaire humiliated by his own maid. The internet would love this. Edward noticed it instantly. No phones, he snapped. The room froze again. Now. One by one, screens lowered, but not before whispers started moving through the table like smoke. She worked on Wall Street. How is she cleaning houses? Why did nobody know? Edward rubbed a hand across his jaw. The movement was sharp, restless. He looked at Naomi again, harder now, searching for something that explained how tonight had spiraled so violently out of his control. You predicted a crash? He asked. Naomi exhaled quietly. Part of one. Part? His pride caught on the word immediately. Do not play humble with me. Naomi looked down at the polished wood table. Reflections of chandeliers shimmered beneath her fingertips. My team warned leadership, she said carefully. Nobody listened until it was too late. One investor leaned forward. Which firm? Naomi hesitated. Too long. Edward noticed. Answer him. His voice cracked sharper now. Less confidence. More desperation. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly. Stonebridge Capital. The room reacted instantly. A quiet ripple of disbelief. Stonebridge had been one of the biggest financial collapses in New York in nearly a decade. Billionaires had lost fortunes. Careers disappeared overnight. Edward's expression changed. Not anger anymore. Recognition. I know that case, he said quietly. The analyst who flagged the risk disappeared. Naomi gave the smallest nod. I left. Why? Edward pressed. Because when my father got sick, she said softly, nobody cared how many forecasts I got right. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything said before. Even the fire seemed quieter. One investor looked away, uncomfortable. Another slowly set down his whiskey glass. But Edward could not let go. Not now. Too much money. Too much ego. Too much damage already threatening to surface. If you are so brilliant, he said, voice tightening again, why are you serving drinks in my house? Naomi's jaw tightened. For the first time all night. Small. Controlled. But there. Because hospitals do not accept intelligence as payment. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The sentence landed like cold water over burning steel. Edward opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time since Naomi arrived, he had no fast comeback. His CFO suddenly rushed toward the table again, breathing harder now. Papers shook slightly in his hands. Sir, he said urgently. This is worse than we thought. Edward turned sharply. What now? The man swallowed. The acquisition company? He glanced toward Naomi once before continuing. They are not only hiding liabilities. His voice dropped lower. The numbers are fake. The entire room shifted. Chairs scraped. Somebody stood up too fast. Fake? Edward barked. What do you mean fake? The CFO looked pale now. Almost sick. I mean, he said quietly, if Naomi is right. He stopped himself, eyes drifting toward the giant windows where snow covered the dark mountain outside. Then he looked back at Edward. Tomorrow is not a business deal. His throat tightened. It is a setup. Edward went completely still. And for the first time all night, fear touched his face. A setup? Edward's voice cracked louder than he intended, echoing against stone walls and polished glass. The room tightened instantly. Investors who had arrived laughing over wine now sat frozen, shoulders stiff, fingers wrapped too tightly around untouched drinks. Outside, snow whipped harder against the windows like something trying to get inside. Edward looked from his CFO to Naomi, then back again, breathing shallower now. Explain, he snapped. The CFO dropped a thick folder onto the table so fast the crystal glass rattled. The shell companies are fake, he said, voice strained. Revenue reports are inflated. Half the assets listed do not exist. Somebody whispered. That is impossible. Another investor quietly unlocked his phone beneath the table. Camera on again. Nobody trusted this room anymore. Naomi stayed still near the fireplace, but she could feel every pair of eyes shifting toward her now. Not respect. Not yet. Suspicion. Pressure. Like she had suddenly become both witness and suspect in a disaster nobody understood. Edward turned toward her sharply. Did you know all this? His tone carried accusation now, desperation hidden beneath it. Naomi blinked once. Not all of it. Convenient, one investor muttered. You show up out of nowhere, predict disaster, and suddenly know everything? Naomi felt heat rise under her skin again. The same old feeling. Smart enough to help. Never trusted enough to believe. I said there was risk, she answered quietly. I did not say I knew everything. Edward paced once beside the table, expensive shoes tapping hard against hardwood. Sharp. Uneven. Losing rhythm. Losing control. His billion-dollar confidence had begun to crack. Tomorrow morning, he said, rubbing a hand across his face. I signed this deal in front of media, shareholders, everyone. His voice tightened. If this blows up, I lose money. The CFO looked sick. Sir, this is bigger than money. Silence hit again. Heavy. Somebody near the back stood slowly. Edward, an older investor said carefully. If this is fraud, your reputation takes the hit too. The sentence landed harder than anything else had all night. Reputation. Power. Legacy. Edward stopped pacing. His jaw flexed. No, he said quickly, almost to himself. No, somebody would have caught this. His eyes locked onto Naomi again. Too hard. Too long. Unless. Naomi felt it before he said it. The shift. Blame looking for somewhere safe to land. You planted this, Edward said quietly. The room froze. Even the fire sounded distant. Naomi stared at him. What? You worked in finance. His voice sharpened. You knew exactly where to look. Maybe you are connected to this. Gasps. Quick whispers. Somebody lowered their phone. Somebody else raised theirs higher. Naomi's chest tightened. Not anger. Exhaustion. Again. Always again. You think I sabotaged your deal, she said softly. Edward did not answer immediately. That hurt worse somehow. Because for one terrible second, he actually looked unsure. I do not know what to think, he admitted finally. You appear in my house. You embarrass me in front of investors. Suddenly everything falls apart. Naomi looked toward the window's snow, blurring the mountain outside into white silence. Her throat tightened, but her voice stayed calm. You embarrass yourself. The room inhaled sharply. One investor nearly choked on his drink. Edward stared at her, stunned. Naomi stepped closer to the table now, tray finally lowered to her side. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. I tried to stop you quietly, she said. You laughed. Another step. I tried to warn you. Another. You called security. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room had shifted again. The maid they mocked was suddenly the only person standing still while billionaires unraveled. Then Naomi's eyes landed on something near the edge of the contract stack. Small. Almost invisible. Her expression changed instantly. Sharp. Focused. Wait, she whispered. Edward frowned. What now? Naomi leaned toward the papers, pulse quickening. Beneath the acquisition seal, buried in tiny print, sat a signature she knew too well. Her face lost color. No, she said quietly. Edward stepped closer. What? Naomi looked up slowly, fear touching her expression for the first time all night. I know who built this fraud. Her voice dropped barely above a whisper. And if I am right. She swallowed hard. Tomorrow is not about stealing your company. The room went silent again. It is about destroying someone before they can talk. The silence hit harder than the shouting ever had. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their drinks anymore. Snow drifted past the giant windows in slow white streaks while the fire cracked softly against cold stone, too small now to warm the room. Naomi stood perfectly still beside the contract papers, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow, but every eye stayed locked on her like she was holding something dangerous no one else could see. Edward Calloway swallowed once. Hard. For the first time all night, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man standing too close to the edge of something collapsing. Who? He asked quietly. The word barely left his mouth. Naomi did not answer right away. Her fingers hovered over the signature buried near the bottom of the page. The black ink looked harmless. Familiar. Too familiar. Naomi. Edward pressed, voice lower now, rough with something unfamiliar. Fear. Who built this? She lifted her eyes slowly. Calm. Controlled. Almost unsettling. Someone who does not make mistakes, she said softly. Someone who only loses when people stop underestimating the person in front of them. A faint vibration broke the silence. Someone's phone buzzing against polished wood. Nobody reached for it. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever this had become. Edward stepped closer to the table. Close enough now to see the tiny tremor in Naomi's fingers. You know them personally? Not a question. Naomi hesitated. Outside, wind scraped against the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, the heating system clicked and hummed before fading again. I used to work for him, she said finally. The room shifted again. Small movements. Tight breaths. Somebody quietly sat back down. Another investor lowered his phone completely. This no longer felt like gossip. It felt dangerous. Edward frowned. Him? Naomi nodded once. He taught me everything. The sentence landed heavy. Too heavy. Edward's jaw flexed. And now he is trying to destroy me? Naomi looked at the contract again, eyes narrowing slightly. No, she said quietly. You are collateral. The words hung there. Cold. Sharp. One investor whispered, Jesus Christ. Edward took a slow step backward, hand dragging across the edge of the table. His confidence had started disappearing piece by piece, like something leaking out of him. Then who is the target? Naomi did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the snowy darkness outside, where mountain lights blinked faintly beneath heavy clouds. She looked tired suddenly. Not weak. Just tired in a way that felt old. Me, she said softly. Nobody breathed. Edward blinked once. Then again. What? Naomi folded her arms loosely, more for steadiness than comfort. The crash prediction at Stonebridge? She said quietly. I was not supposed to survive that professionally. Her voice stayed calm, but something moved beneath it. Memory. Pain. Someone buried my name. Ruined my references. Made sure nobody hired me again. One investor leaned forward slowly. Why? Naomi gave the faintest humorless smile. Because I caught him lying. The room shifted again. Not suspicion anymore. Something else now. Respect mixed with unease. Fear, maybe? Edward stared at her differently for the first time all night. No superiority. No mockery. Just the terrifying realization that the person he had humiliated might have been fighting battles bigger than anyone in this room understood. His phone suddenly lit up against the table. A sharp vibration cut through the silence. Unknown number. Once. Twice. 3 times. Edward frowned. Do not answer that, Naomi said immediately. Quiet voice. Absolute certainty. Everyone looked at her. Why? Edward asked. Naomi's eyes stayed on the glowing screen. Because if I am right, she said softly, that call means they already know this deal is falling apart. Nobody moved. The phone buzzed again. Longer this time. Persistent. The room had gone so quiet even the heating vents sounded loud. Edward looked between the screen and Naomi. How could they know? Naomi swallowed once. Slow. Controlled. Then her eyes shifted toward the far corner of the room where one investor still held his phone just a little too tightly. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. Because, she said quietly, voice dropping almost to a whisper, someone in this room is already working for them. I think we should all put our phones on the table. Naomi's voice came soft, almost quiet, but something about the calm in it made the room obey before anyone understood why. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody rolled their eyes. The fire cracked against stone while cold light from the snow outside painted pale reflections across expensive watches and nervous faces. Edward stood motionless near the head of the table, phone still buzzing in his hand, looking less like the man who owned the room and more like someone trapped inside it. You think one of us is involved? An investor asked sharply. Naomi glanced toward the corner where the older man still gripped his phone too tightly. I think someone here has been reporting everything all night. The sentence landed like broken glass. Breathing changed instantly. Chairs shifted. A nervous laugh died halfway through someone's throat. Edward's face hardened again, but now the anger felt desperate. Enough, he snapped. Nobody is accusing anybody without proof. Naomi nodded once. Calm. Respectful. But unshaken. You are right, she said quietly. So let us test it. She pointed toward Edward's phone. Still vibrating against his palm. Unknown number. Again. And again. Answer, she said. The room froze. Edward frowned. You told me not to. I changed my mind. Her voice stayed level. Put it on speaker. Nobody moved. Even the snow outside seemed quieter somehow. Edward hesitated, jaw tight. Pride fought fear across his face. Then finally, with too many eyes watching, he pressed accept. Silence. Static. A slow breath through the speaker. Then a voice. Calm. Older. Controlled. You should have signed already. The room turned cold. Naomi's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. She knew that voice. We both know hesitation is expensive, Edward, the man continued smoothly. Especially when house staff start getting curious. Nobody breathed. One investor looked directly at Naomi now. Another slowly lowered his drink. Edward swallowed. Who is this? He demanded, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. A quiet chuckle came through the speaker. You know exactly who this is. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Just 1 second. Like bracing against an old wound reopening. Then the voice shifted. Sharper now. I warned you years ago, Naomi. The room snapped toward her instantly. Edward turned so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. What? Naomi opened her eyes slowly. Calm. Too calm. Do not, the man said over speaker. Pretend you still think integrity matters. Silence swallowed the room whole. Somebody's phone slipped from trembling fingers onto carpet. Edward stared at Naomi like he no longer understood anything happening inside his own house. You know him, he said quietly. Not accusation anymore. Shock. Naomi nodded once. Marcus Voss. The name landed heavy. Several investors reacted immediately. One cursed under his breath. Another stood up completely. Marcus Voss. Billionaire financier. Untouchable. Brilliant. Dangerous. The same man whispered about in lawsuits nobody ever won. Edward's face lost color. He is behind this. Naomi's gaze drifted toward the snowy darkness outside. He has always been behind things. Through the speaker, Marcus laughed softly. Controlled. Chilling. You should have stayed invisible, Naomi. Her throat tightened, but her voice never shook. You should have stopped stealing from people. Silence. Then breathing. Slow. Measured. On the other end of the line. Still brave, Marcus said quietly. That is why nobody believed you. The sentence hit harder than shouting. Naomi lowered her eyes for half a second. Old hurt flickered there. Fast. Gone. Around the room, something changed. Investors who had looked at her with suspicion were watching differently now. Not pity. Recognition. Realization. She had not ruined the night. She had walked into it already carrying scars none of them had seen. Edward looked at Naomi again. Really looked this time. The woman he mocked. Humiliated. Tried to throw out. And suddenly every joke he made felt ugly sitting inside the silence. Marcus spoke again. Edward, he said calmly. Sign tomorrow and you survive. Walk away, and I release everything. Edward stiffened. Everything? Naomi's expression shifted instantly. Fear touched her face for the first time since the call began. Real fear. No, she whispered. Too late. Marcus exhaled softly into the speaker. I kept her secret all these years. A pause. Heavy. Deliberate. Then quietly. Tell me, Edward, did your Harvard maid ever explain why she disappeared right after federal investigators started asking questions? Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Edward slowly turned toward Naomi. And for the first time all night, she looked afraid. The room forgot how to breathe. Edward stood frozen beside the table, his face drained of color, as Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time all night. Not shame. Something older. Heavier. The fire cracked softly against stone while snow drifted outside like the world had slowed just to watch this moment unfold. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody checked a phone. Even the investors, who had whispered about her, now sat motionless, caught somewhere between guilt and disbelief. Marcus's voice still lingered through the speaker like smoke. Federal investigators, Edward repeated quietly, almost to himself. The words sounded unreal coming out of his mouth. Naomi exhaled slowly. Her shoulders stayed steady, but her fingers tightened briefly against the silver tray before relaxing again. Tell them, Marcus said coldly through the phone. Tell them why you vanished. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Then opened them again. Calm. Composed. Because nobody protected people like me, she said quietly. The sentence landed softly, but somehow hit harder than shouting. She stepped toward the table, warm chandelier light catching the exhaustion beneath her eyes. Stonebridge collapsed because executives were moving money illegally, she said. I reported it. Silence. Thick. Absolute. Edward stared at her. Somebody near the fireplace lowered their phone slowly. Another investor leaned back in stunned disbelief. Naomi's voice never rose. Federal investigators came to me after the crash. Then somehow, her jaw tightened slightly. Evidence disappeared. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Suddenly I became the problem, she said softly. Nobody wanted to hire the woman who almost exposed billionaires. Marcus laughed quietly through the speaker. You always did enjoy playing the victim. Edward's expression changed instantly. Anger now. Real anger. Not at Naomi. At himself. At the voice on the phone. At the realization settling hard into his chest. He looked at Naomi again, really looked this time. The woman he mocked in front of guests. The woman he nearly threw out. The same woman who had quietly tried to save him anyway. You knew, he said softly, almost ashamed. You knew this was coming. Naomi nodded once. I recognized the structure. Edward rubbed a hand across his face, jaw trembling with something dangerously close to regret. And I humiliated you. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Nobody in the room looked comfortable anymore. One investor cleared his throat awkwardly. Another stared down at the table like eye contact. Suddenly felt impossible. Naomi said nothing. That somehow made it worse. Edward looked around the room, at the same people who laughed when he laughed. Followed when he mocked. Nobody looked proud of themselves now. No, he said quietly, voice rougher. I humiliated the only person trying to stop this. Marcus scoffed through the speaker. Touching. Edward grabbed the phone suddenly. You used her, he said sharply. You buried her. The billionaire on the other end chuckled. No, Edward. People like you buried her. The sentence cut through the room like cold air. Edward stopped speaking. Because deep down, he knew it was true. Naomi had walked into this house carrying degrees, warnings, scars, truth, and he only saw a Maid uniform. Around the room, the shift finally happened. Investors who once watched her with amusement now looked at her with something heavier. Respect. Admiration. Regret. One older woman quietly stood and stepped closer to Naomi. I laughed earlier, she admitted softly. I should not have. Naomi offered the faintest smile. Small. Graceful. It is okay, she said quietly. No bitterness. No revenge. Somehow that hurt more than anger would have. Edward swallowed hard. No, he said, stepping forward now. It is not okay. His voice dropped lower. Honest for the first time all night. I judged you before you even spoke. Naomi met his eyes finally. Calm. Steady. Most people do. The honesty in that sentence left the room silent again. Then Edward's phone buzzed sharply in his hand. Once. Twice. 3 times. A new message lit the screen. Unknown sender. Attached file. Only 4 words beneath it. Ask Naomi about tomorrow. Edward frowned slowly. Naomi's expression changed instantly. The calm slipped. Just for a second. Real fear crossed her face. Do not open that, she whispered. Too late. Edward had already tapped the screen. And as the file loaded, the color drained from his face. The color drained from Edward's face so completely it looked as if the warmth had left the room with it. Nobody spoke. The fire had burned lower now, shadows stretching long across polished wood and untouched wine glasses. On Edward's phone sat a single file. Already opened. A grainy federal memo. Naomi Carter, protected witness status, recommended. Followed by another line that hit harder than anything said all night. Investigation compromised after internal leak. Suspected retaliation from senior financial partners. Edward looked up slowly. His hand shook once before stilling. You were telling the truth, he said quietly. It was not a question anymore. Naomi stood near the edge of the room, shoulders relaxed, eyes tired but steady. Outside, the storm had softened. Snow drifted slower now beneath pale mountain lights. I tried to, she said softly. No anger. No victory. Just honesty worn thin by years of nobody listening. Around the room, phones lowered one by one. Nobody wanted footage anymore. The story had stopped being entertaining somewhere between humiliation and truth. It had become something heavier. One investor quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another stared into his untouched drink like it suddenly tasted different. Edward swallowed hard. And I laughed at you. The words sounded smaller now. Real. Human. He glanced toward the silver tray still resting in Naomi's hands, then toward the chair at the head of the table where he had sat all night believing he controlled everything. I called security on the only person trying to save me. Naomi looked down for a moment, then back at him. You did not know me, she said quietly. Edward gave the faintest shake of his head. No, he said. I decided who you were before I ever asked. Silence settled again, but this time softer. Not sharp anymore. Reflective. Even the house sounded quieter now. The heating system hummed low beneath the distant wind outside. Somebody near the back finally stood. An older investor. The same man who had laughed earlier. He walked slowly toward Naomi, uncomfortable in his own skin. Miss Carter, he said carefully, voice rough with embarrassment. For what it is worth. I was wrong. Others followed in smaller ways. A quiet nod. A lowered gaze. One woman placed her untouched glass down and simply whispered, Thank you. Naomi nodded politely to each of them. Graceful. Calm. No bitterness. Somehow that landed harder than anger ever could. Edward looked around the room once, then reached slowly for the stack of acquisition papers. Without drama, without announcement, he folded the contract closed. The sound echoed softly through the room. Final. The deal is dead, he said quietly. Nobody argued. Nobody even looked surprised anymore. He turned back toward Naomi. And tomorrow, he added, I think there are some people who need to answer for what happened to you. Naomi looked at him for a long second. Snow light reflected softly in her eyes. Maybe, she said. But I stopped waiting for people to do the right thing a long time ago. That hurt him more than anger would have. Edward looked down briefly, ashamed in a way money could not solve. Then, after a moment, he pulled out the chair at the head of the table. The same chair where he had ruled the room all night. Sit, he said quietly. The room shifted. Nobody missed what it meant. Naomi frowned slightly. I am still staff. Edward shook his head once. No, he said softly. You were the smartest person in this room the moment you walked in. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody disagreed. Naomi hesitated, then slowly placed the silver tray down on the table. Metal touched oak with the softest sound. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she looked around the room one last time. The same faces that once dismissed her now watched in complete silence. Respect had arrived quietly. Too late, maybe? But real. By the time dawn began brushing pale gold across the mountain windows, the storm had almost passed. Naomi stepped outside into the cold morning air, coat wrapped close, breath soft against the fading dark. Behind her, through the giant glass walls, Edward still stood watching. Not like a man looking down anymore. Like a man finally learning how wrong he had been. Naomi never looked back. She simply walked toward the sunrise, steady and unhurried, while inside the house full of billionaires, nobody said a word.